Well, Neil, let's start off with the news that broke last night that Japan is changing its carbon targets, and probably not for the better, as far as many people see it. What was the reaction of yourself and the Alliance of Small Island States to that news?
Speaking as the lead spokesman for the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, I can say that we were very dismayed by the news. The Japanese delegation came to meet us in our coordination meeting, and while we understand the reasons that they gave, that all the nuclear reactors, all the nuclear power stations are offline, we cannot help but be dismayed because it comes out with a great disappointment that we've had with the Australians and the Canadians on their attitude to emissions. And if you put them together without looking at the individual reasons for doing it, it looks like there's some major backsliding going on amongst Annex 1 emitters. The second message we would like to convey to the Japanese is obviously now that they can't rely on nuclear power, they have to choose something else. And we think that it is a great opportunity for the Japanese to now invest in clean energy, to try as much as possible shift to renewables rather than backslide even further onto fossil fuels, which would increase again their carbon emissions. So we hope that they see this challenge, this problem as a challenge, as an opportunity to improve on their performance rather than slide backwards.
You mentioned Australia and Canada. Australia started the process, I guess, of repealing their carbon tax earlier this week, which was followed by a statement from the Canadian Prime Minister saying that was really a jolly good idea. What's been the sort of reactions within negotiations and at diplomatic levels to Australia's backsliding of ambition?
Well, first of all, Australia, their position is really baffling in the sense that Australia is in one of the hotspots of climate change. They have links through the Pacific Island Forum. They are part of the Pacific Island Forum with the Pacific Islands, some of which are the most threatened by climate change, some of which will be the first to disappear from sea level rise, that they should take this sort of attitude in that part of the world with the links, the historical, traditional, political, cultural links they have with these islands is baffling. What dismayed us even more about the Canadian approach is that when the Prime Minister of Canada applauds Australia's scrapping of the carbon tax, it seems as if they're encouraging other major emitters, other Annex 1 countries to follow suit. And this obviously has caused great concern amongst us here, especially when all this, Canada, Australia, Japan, comes against the backdrop of what's just happened in the Philippines. It's incomprehensible that people who are amongst the most responsible for climate change historically should be acting like this at a time when we're seeing, when Philippines showed us the very worst of what climate change can be, and we know there's more on the way.
Does it appear slightly odd to you that this all seems to happen while a climate conference is taking place?
Well, in the case of Japan, Canada, and Australia, they can plan this. It is something they can avoid to do, they can choose to do or not choose to do. In the case of Philippines, unfortunately, this is the time of year when they are hit. Remember, in Doha, they were hit by a typhoon whilst we were in the talks. But in the case of Japan and of Australia and Canada, they started their actions before the COP. In the case of Japan, I think it's just very bad, unfortunate timing that they come after what's happening in the Philippines. So we would hope that after in fact, the ongoing tragedy in the Philippines, that countries like this would relook at their positions. And other countries amongst the Annex 1 don't take this as an excuse for themselves to start easing off on their emissions. In fact, we would hope that some of them would take up the slack. So we would encourage them to take up the slack. We know the EU, we are now in the EU, are having problems with getting their act together. But we hope that what's happening in they would look to what's happening in the Philippines rather than look to what's happening in Japan, Canada, and Australia as to when they're planning what they're going to do next.
Does the fact that Japan is almost reneging on a deal that was made, under the UN, it might not have been binding, but it was under the UN, does that make it all the more tough to take when you're at a conference like this, when you're working towards a legally binding deal? Does it make people wonder whether even that deal will be as sort of watertight as it should be?
Well, for example, when we heard from Japan of what was going to happen, our first reaction is, who's next? What haven't we heard yet? Can it get any worse than that? Because just at the time when we should all be ramping up, and this is what all the ADP discussions about, the 2015, what ramifications will it have for the discussions for 2015, which is just 2 years down the road? If you're backsliding now, how are we going to make up for the lost ground, let alone, it was already insufficient, how are we going to make up for the lost ground, let alone what we had to do even before these countries took these positions?
You mentioned the EU as well. In Durban in 2011, there was a great, I'm not sure what the coalition was called, Coalition of Ambition maybe, between AOSIS, Alliance of Small Island States, the least developed countries, and the EU. How would you assess how that has developed over the past few years? Do you sense you still have common ground with the EU, and are you happy with the way that particular bloc is working at the moment?
One of the reasons AOSIS has always worked well with the EU was in the past, and I stress in the past or until now, they have been the most progressive amongst the Annex I, until they started to run into problems with their own policy. And now they are being surpassed, not only by other Annex I countries, but even countries in the developing world, countries like Mexico, for example. Even China now is taking action that is very encouraging. The US is taking action that's very encouraging. And suddenly the EU is not at the front anymore. It doesn't mean that we no longer work with them. On the contrary, we told them you can expect us to put even more pressure on you because we feel that you've been traditional allies in the climate change battle with us, and we're a bit concerned to see the way you're falling behind. And we keep on pressing them in our meetings. We keep on meeting with them, like we meet with other bilaterals with others. And in fact, now our message to them is look at what's happening after what happened with Japan and Canada and Australia. We'll be looking to them to step up, to try and take up the slack, not only in getting their act together, but in responding to what's happening with other Annex I emitters.
Just a few more questions. In terms of the proposals that AOSIS have put forward regarding a technical paper regarding ways of ramping up, I guess, renewable energy, that was well received at talks earlier this year. Can you give us any sense about how that has progressed, and is that going to lead to any, I don't know, resolution or whatever it could lead to at the end of this conference?
It's still turning out to be a hard slog. What is encouraging to us is that all the submissions that we are being put forward, people are reading them and are asking to meet us to explain further what we mean by it. So no one's just batting them off the table. They're actually discussing and saying, in most cases, there's something in the AOSIS position, maybe we can work on it. But, and especially on loss and damage and work stream 2. But our stance on work stream 2 has caused some concern within work stream 1 as to what effect it's going to have on work stream 1. And of late, there has been a move by some countries to give more attention to work stream 1 and work stream 2. But we remind them that AOSIS agreed to the work stream 1 and the ADP package on condition that we had work stream 2, so that we can, as much as possible, ramp up ambition under pre-2020 rather than wait for 2015 or 2020. And what's been happening amongst Annex 1 shows that we were right in the first place to be very cautious and to say we can't afford to wait for this to happen. Otherwise, if we hadn't gotten work stream 2 working, we'd be in even a worse position. As far as loss and damage is concerned, when we push loss and damage, the super typhoons hadn't happened. So we're hoping that now that we've seen a super typhoon, that the question as to whether we need a loss and damage mechanism is a moot one. We're hoping that people say, okay, we definitely need loss and damage. We're definitely moving beyond adaptation into loss and damage. And the issue will be, how do we set it up? One of our concerns is that there are some people who are saying that loss and damage should be put under adaptation rather than have a separate international mechanism. Our argument is that loss and damage is not adaptation. Well, loss and damage is when adaptation fails. Loss and damage is when you cannot adapt. Loss and damage is when it's impossible to adapt. That's when you're in loss and damage. How can you put it under adaptation? That's the position we're taking now.
Is there a case for saying, working on yet another mechanism that's just too much focus on process, and where's the action?
I think that has been one of the reasons why people want to park it under adaptation. We're calling for a totally different mechanism, still under the convention for this, because we're having to react to it anyway. People are reacting to what's happening in the Philippines anyway, and we can see how the reaction is. It's all chaotic because they've never faced something of that scale before. And so we're saying, if you disagree with us, come up with something viable, come up with something. But to us, it does not do the subject service if you put it under adaptation, especially since before loss and damage, AOCIS and other vulnerable countries always complained that adaptation itself did not get the attention it deserved. We always thought mitigation was getting more attention than adaptation, which does not mean that we're not mitigation people, obviously. We're emissions first, cutting emissions first. So this is a discussion that's on the table, in that if we're going to use other mechanisms that already exist, are they up to the task of it? Or is this something so off the scale, as people are talking about the typhoon, that you need something totally new to address it? Of course, that also addresses the issue of where you're going to get the funds, but as you see, it just gets more complicated as we go along.
Just one final question. In terms of proposals that were launched or put forward this week from Brazil, and I think it was Brazil and 130 other countries, relating to historical responsibility and a push to get this, I guess, clarified. The USA and EU don't seem to be too keen on that concept. Where do you see that particular issue going? Is this going to sort of rumble on? Because I guess historical responsibility goes to the sort of crux of a lot of the issues here.
I think the core issue is that there's mistrust amongst the developing countries as to where especially climate financing is headed. As they see more attempts to bring the private sector in, it's not the private sector per se, it's are you shirking your responsibility and passing it on to private sector who are more interested in profits and loans rather than grant and aid? Are you trying to say to the developing countries that we have to take on more responsibility for paying for damage that we didn't cause? So there's a suspicion there as to what's behind all this, and it's also affecting the Working Stream 2 negotiations. And if you see Brazil has come forward with this and other developing countries are supporting them in G77, it's because there's this mistrust there as to where are we headed, what are your aims and objectives in Annex 1 as you push the private sector agenda, as you push other agendas, which looks as if at a time when you're no longer your ambition is not up to scratch, looks as if you're trying to shirk your responsibilities, your historical responsibility for it. So it depends on how they react to the Brazilian initiative for us to see what's going to happen.